Fide. Listen carefully, because most people misunderstand what an empath really is. They think it's softness, kindness, endless patience, but that's only the surface. Underneath that calm exterior is a mind that is constantly scanning, constantly absorbing, constantly calculating emotional patterns most people don't even notice. And here's the truth no one warns you about. When you feel everything, you don't just feel the good, you carry the weight of the bad, the lies, the manipulation, the hidden intentions. At first, an empath tolerates more than anyone else. They justify your behavior, they give you chances, they rewrite your actions into something less harmful just to keep the peace. But every time they do that, something builds quietly in the background. Not rage, not hatred, but awareness. And awareness is dangerous when it reaches a breaking point. Because the dark side of an empath is not explosive, it's precise, it's controlled, it's silent. When they finally see you clearly, when the illusion breaks, they don't argue, they don't beg, they don't explain, they simply disconnect. And when that switch flips, it doesn't flip back. You need to understand this. An empath's patience is not weakness. It's observation time. It's data collection. Every word you say, every inconsistency, every subtle disrespect, it's all being recorded, processed, and stored. And while you think they're too nice to react, they are actually deciding whether you deserve access to them at all. Now, here's where most people get it wrong. They think the empath's breaking point is emotional. It's not. It's logical. It's the moment their internal system concludes this connection is no longer safe, no longer balanced, no longer worth the energy. And once that conclusion is made, the emotional attachment dissolves faster than you can fix it. This is why you must be careful not to empaths, but of underestimating them. Because when an empath learns to combine emotional intelligence with boundaries, they become something entirely different. They are no longer absorbing everything. They are choosing what deserves their energy. And that shift makes them incredibly powerful. So, if you are an empath, understand this clearly. Your dark side is not something to fear, it's something to master. It's the part of you that says enough. It's the part that refuses to be drained, manipulated, or disrespected any longer. But if you don't control it, if you let it build without awareness, it will turn into isolation, into emotional shutdown, into cutting people off without understanding why. The goal is not to lose your empathy. The goal is to refine it, to filter it, to direct it only where it is respected and reciprocated. Because empathy without boundaries is self-sabotage, but empathy with discipline is influence, clarity, and strength. And once you reach that level, you don't just feel people anymore, you understand them. And when you understand people, you stop being controlled by them. Empathy is often mistaken for simple kindness, but in reality, it is a heightened psychological awareness that allows a person to read emotional patterns, inconsistencies, and unspoken intentions with unusual accuracy. And this ability, when left unmanaged, can slowly turn into a hidden burden, because the empath begins to absorb not only positive emotions, but also stress, negativity, and manipulation from others, leading to an internal buildup that is rarely expressed. Outwardly, over time this suppression creates what can be described as the dark side, which is not evil, but rather a combination of emotional exhaustion, delayed anger, and hyper-awareness that reaches a critical threshold. And when that threshold is crossed, the empath does not react in a dramatic or impulsive way, but instead makes a calculated psychological shift where they detach, withdraw, and permanently reduce or eliminate emotional access to the source of imbalance, which can appear sudden to others, but is actually the result of long-term observation and internal evaluation, making it essential to understand that empathy without boundaries becomes vulnerability. As the empath continues to give energy without filtering who deserves it, ultimately leading to burnout and disconnection. Whereas developing clear personal limits transforms empathy into a controlled and selective strength that protects mental stability while maintaining emotional intelligence. And this balance is crucial because it allows the empath to remain compassionate without becoming overwhelmed, to stay aware without becoming reactive, and to engage with others without losing their sense of self. which is why the real power of empathy lies not in feeling everything deeply, but in choosing deliberately what to feel, what to ignore, and where to invest emotional energy, ensuring that awareness becomes a tool for clarity and growth, rather than a pathway to self-neglect or silent resentment. Empathy is often misunderstood, stood as simple kindness, but in reality, it is a form of heightened emotional awareness that allows a person to detect subtle shifts in behavior, tone, and intention, often before others even recognize them. And this constant perception creates a unique psychological environment where the empath is not just experiencing their own emotions, but also processing the emotional states of those around them, which over time can become overwhelming if not properly managed. This is where the so-called dark side begins to develop, not as something negative by nature, but as a natural consequence of prolonged emotional absorption without boundaries, leading to internal fatigue, suppressed frustration, and a growing sensitivity to patterns of disrespect or imbalance. And while the empath may continue to appear calm and understanding on the surface, internally they are gathering information, analyzing behavior, and slowly reaching conclusions about the people in their environment, making it as important to recognize that their patience is not unlimited, but rather a phase of observation and tolerance that eventually leads to a critical point of decision. When that internal threshold is reached, the empath's response is rarely loud or chaotic. Instead, it is controlled, deliberate, and often final, as they shift from emotional engagement to logical detachment, cutting off or distancing themselves from situations that no longer feel safe or balanced, which can seem sudden to others, but is actually the result of a long process of evaluation and emotional processing. And this is why understanding the importance of boundaries is essential, because without them empathy becomes a source of vulnerability, rather than strength, allowing others to take advantage of the empath's willingness to understand and forgive. Whereas with clear limits in place, empathy transforms into a powerful tool for insight, connection, and self-protection, enabling the individual to choose where to invest their energy and when to step back, ultimately creating a balanced state where emotional intelligence supports well-being instead of undermining it, and where awareness is used not just to understand others, but also to preserve one's own mental and emotional stability. Empathy is often seen as a soft emotional trait, but in reality, it functions more like a constant psychological scanning system that picks up emotional signals from people, environments, and interactions that most individuals overlook. And because of this heightened sensitivity, an empath is continuously processing more emotional data than the average person, which means their mind rarely gets complete rest from external influence. Over time, this creates a silent accumulation of emotional weight, where not only positive feelings are absorbed, but also stress, manipulation, dishonesty, and unresolved tension from others. And because empaths tend to prioritize understanding over reaction, they often suppress their own discomfort in order to maintain harmony, which may appear like patience or tolerance on the outside, but internally builds a complex emotional load that slowly shifts their perception of relationships and trust, making them more observant, more cautious, and more aware of patterns that signal imbalance or disrespect. As this internal awareness deepens, the empath begins to develop what is often misunderstood as a dark side, but it is not darkness in a harmful sense. Rather, it is the result of accumulated emotional intelligence combined with unexpressed frustration and overexposure to the emotional states of others. And this phase is marked by increased internal analysis, where the empath starts recognizing repeated behaviors, hidden intentions, and emotional inconsistencies that were previously ignored. And although they may continue to act understanding externally, internally they are forming clear boundaries and evaluating whether the emotional investment they are giving is being matched or exploited, which is why their tolerance should never be mistaken for weakness, because it is actually a form of controlled observation, where every interaction is being processed and stored for long-term judgment. Eventually, this process reaches a psychological threshold where the empath no longer feels the need to explain, argue, or emotionally engage with situations that feel draining or unbalanced. And instead, they shift into a state of emotional detachment that is calm, silent, and often permanent, because at that point their mind has already reached a conclusion based on long-term emotional evidence, rather than sudden reaction. And this is where the importance of boundaries becomes essential, as without them the empath risks emotional exhaustion and isolation. But with them, they gain clarity, stability, and control over their emotional environment. ICNs forming their sensitivity into a refined form of intelligence that allows them to understand people deeply without osing themselves in the process, ensuring that their empathy becomes a source of strength rather than self-destruction. Empathy is not just an emotional quality, it is a continuous psychological processing system that constantly reads the emotions, intentions, and subtle behavioral signals of others, often without conscious effort. And because of this heightened sensitivity, an empath experiences life on a much deeper emotional frequency than most people, absorbing not only spoken words, but also unspoken tension, discomfort, and hidden meanings behind interactions, which gradually builds an internal emotional load that they rarely express outwardly, as they are naturally inclined to maintain peace and avoid conflict. However, this constant absorption creates an imbalance, where the empath becomes a container for other people's unresolved emotions. And over time, this leads to mental fatigue, emotional confusion, and a growing sense of responsibility for feelings that do not belong to them, making it difficult for them to distinguish between their own emotional state and the emotional influence of their environment. As this process continues, the empath begins to develop an advanced level of awareness that functions almost like psychological pattern recognition, where they start noticing repetition in behavior, manipulation tactics, emotional inconsistencies, and subtle forms of disrespect that were previously ignored in the name of understanding or compassion. This stage is often misunderstood by others as overthinking or withdrawal, but in reality, it is the mind shifting from emotional absorption to analytical observation, where the empath is no longer just feeling everything, but is also evaluating whether the emotional energy they are giving is being respected, misused, or taken for granted. And this shift marks the beginning of internal boundaries forming silently without confrontation. Eventually, when emotional overload reaches a certain threshold, the empath does not react in a dramatic or chaotic way, because their response is not driven by impulse, but by long-term psychological processing. And instead of expressing anger or frustration openly, they begin to detach emotionally in a controlled and deliberate manner, slowly reducing access to their time, attention, and emotional availability, which can appear sudden to others, but is actually the result of extended observation and internal decision-making, where the empath has already concluded that continued emotional investment is no longer healthy or balanced. And this is where their so-called dark side is revealed not as aggression, but as complete emotional withdrawal. In this final stage, the empath's silence becomes more powerful than any confrontation, because once they disconnect, they rarely return to previous emotional attachments. And this is not due to hatred, but due to clarity, as they have already processed every emotional pattern and reached a final understanding of the relationship dynamics involved, which is why the importance of boundaries becomes critical. Without them, empathy turns into self-drain and emotional exhaustion. But with them, it transforms into controlled emotional intelligence that allows the empath to remain compassionate while protecting their inner stability, ensuring that their sensitivity becomes a strength used for understanding life deeply, rather than a vulnerability that leads to silent self-destruction.